Hello everybody, welcome to this very first webinar for the IEPPEC Energy Evaluation Academy. It's very exciting for IEPPEC and I'm certainly delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm Charles Michaelis, obviously as Hans said, and I'm going to first give you some background to me and IEPPEC. Then I'm going to describe what evaluation is, talk a bit about how to conduct evaluation, then briefly explain how IEPPEC can help, and finally point you in the direction of some resources that you might find useful to learn more about the subject. So, about me. Well, there I am, maybe a little bit older than I was in that photo. I've got 25 years evaluation experience, so I've been doing this since the early 1990s. Particularly in the energy, waste and research and development fields. And most of my experience is in the UK and Australia, but I've also worked quite a lot in China and Southeast Asia. I'm one of the organisers of the IEPPEC conference in Europe. I'm on the planning committee, so we plan each conference, and on the board that manages the whole activity. And I'm chairman of a research and evaluation company called Data Build Research and Solutions. Just a little bit of background about IEPPEC. It's the International Energy Policy and Programme Evaluation Conference, so it's not surprising that it gets shortened to IEPPEC because that's a bit of a mouthful. It's the only conference for evaluation of energy policy and programmes. It is a peer-reviewed conference, so we make sure all the papers are very high quality, and we'd expect to get 200 or so evaluation professionals to each conference. It's every 2 years in Europe. The next one is in Amsterdam in June this year, and we have a sister conference in North America. The next one of those is in Baltimore in 2017, and we're planning a conference in Asia, but that's very early days yet. And to continue with the introductions, just to tell you about Data Build, we're a research and evaluation consultancy. We were established in 1985, and we have offices in Birmingham in the UK and Sydney in Australia, 25 staff, and we specialise in energy and waste, enterprise innovation and planning. So a small evaluation consultancy. So just as an introduction, this is an example of evaluation in practice. These guys might not have needed a formal evaluation to decide what was working and what wasn't, but it's an example about how in all of our lives every day we do evaluate things. But in terms of a formal definition, evaluation is an objective process of understanding how a policy or programme was implemented, what effects it had, for whom and why. And that objective bit is really important. It involves standing back and looking at what's been done, what's been achieved, what hasn't been achieved, how it worked, so you get a real independent understanding rather than trying to prove something was good or prove something was bad. And what it does is it leads to more effective policies and programs. By learning from what we've done, by evaluating what we've done, what we do in the future can be more effective. An evaluation sits in the centre of the sort of policy-making cycle. So if we look at the boxes around the edge of this circle, rationale, objectives, appraisal, monitoring, evaluation and feedback, that's a classic description of policy making. You might have seen that or other ones like it. And I would certainly argue that evaluation should sit in the centre of that. It's essential to every stage. So you develop a rationale, set objectives and appraise those objectives. That's also known as ex-ante evaluation. You monitor what's going on. You formally step back and think about it. You feed back into the policy process. That's what's known as ex post evaluation. Ex post evaluation normally consists of three elements: process evaluation, so how has it gone, impact evaluation, what's been achieved, and economic evaluation, was it value for money? So as we go through this webinar, I'm going to describe to you how to conduct an evaluation. And I'll use as an example an imaginary program to subsidise energy efficiency in poor and vulnerable households. Just having in your mind the sort of thing that you've probably seen in most European or North American countries. Evaluation, when we conduct evaluations, we generally go through a relatively sort of consistent process. And there are 5 steps. The first one is to develop a theory of change. I'll talk about each of these steps in detail in a minute. Then you'd want to set evaluation questions. What are we trying to find out? Develop an evaluation plan. How are we going to answer those questions? Set about answering those questions, and you'd use a combination of collecting data, analysis, interpreting that data, and then finally, and probably most importantly, using what you've done, what you've learned, how you've interpreted it to inform the policy development, and also to share that more widely. So this is a theory of change. People also call it things like a logic map or a program logic. I imagine if you're involved in policy making, you'll have come across these before. And generally they start with some inputs. So in our imaginary program, that would be some funding maybe to subsidise measures. Those inputs fund activities. So that would be telling people about the scheme, distributing the say some light bulbs or other things. That would lead to some outputs. People sign up for the scheme, they implement some measures, would lead you to some outcomes, saving energy, for example, which would lead you to some impacts, which would be things like reducing fuel poverty, greater comfort in people's homes, greater health of occupants, things like that. So the theory of change articulates what we're setting out to do and what we think might happen. And the crucial thing about a theory of change is that we understand how it's expected to work, what's expected to happen. So we should be asking questions around the theory of change like, what evidence have we got? When do we expect all these things to happen? Who's going to do what? And are different people going to behave differently? So, for example, if we're subsidising poor or vulnerable households, there may be some elderly people in there and there may be some young families in there, and they may behave very differently. How will people engage with the programme? How will the measures be installed? How will people be told about it? And what will people do? And then we've also got some questions on the right-hand side, which are more about what's happened. So why did it happen? What else could have caused the impacts and the outcomes we're seeing? What are the risks around our activity? And underpinning all of these questions is how will we know? How will we know what is really going on, and how will we be able to answer these questions? So, using the theory of change, we can develop some evaluation questions. And typically, those would fall into 5 sort of categories. There would be a question about what's happened. So, how has energy consumption in people's homes changed? Are they using more or less? Has the mix of energy changed? Have the end users changed? What difference did the policy or programme make to that? So these changes might have been caused by the policy or the programme, or they might have been going to happen anyway, or something else might have caused them. Those 2 questions are typically thought of as impact evaluation questions. We might also want to ask questions about things like how well was the programme implemented? And how can we do things better? What can we learn from what we've done now for the future? Those are typical process evaluation questions. And then the last question on this slide, was the policy programme good value for money? That's the one that the funders and the Treasury departments want to know about, and you would think about that as an economic evaluation question. You'd normally develop some high-level evaluation questions, which might look a bit like this, and then you'd ask sub-questions underneath it. So, for example, what difference did the policy or programme make? Did it make a difference? Was the difference different for different user groups? Gosh, 3 differences in one sentence. Was the policy or programme good value for money? You might then look at different elements of the policy or programme and say, were each of those good value for money? So you would expand on those evaluation questions in planning the evaluation. You wouldn't develop these in isolation. You'd work closely with stakeholders, with maybe your funders, the people who you're going to present the evaluation to. Maybe if you had a delivery partner who was delivering the programme, you'd involve them. You might have other members of your policy team who you'd want to involve in that. So you would consult widely on those questions and make sure that they were answering everybody's needs. The next step of the work would be to develop an evaluation plan, which is really setting out how you're going to go about answering the evaluation questions. And the place to start with that is, what do we already know? Because you will know a lot already. Now, it might not all be written down somewhere, and it might not all be in formal reports, but you won't have developed your policy or programme in a vacuum. There'll be a lot of information you already know, and it's quite important at an early stage to marshal all that information, to draw it all together. So you can then answer the question, well, what else do we need to find out? Where will the information come from, and how will we analyse it? And that forms the bones of your evaluation plan. You'll need to think about your audience and how you're going to disseminate the results of your evaluation at this stage, because you need to make sure that you're collecting the information that people will need. Again, it's important to consult widely. And it's also very important to write it down, to document clearly what you're planning to do, and then to monitor that as you do it. That way you can both communicate what you're doing to others, you've got a record of what you've done, so next time you do an evaluation, you can learn from this one. So we've developed a theory of change, we've got some evaluation questions, we've developed an evaluation plan. The next stage, actually let's do an evaluation. So as I said, evaluation normally consists of 3 elements. A process element, answering the question, how did it go? An impact evaluation, what difference did it make? And an economic evaluation, was it value for money? So I'm going to talk about each of those 3. Starting with the process evaluation, you'll draw information for a process evaluation from 3 sources, typically. The first one is program delivery information. You will know, for example, thinking back to our imaginary example, how many installations you've done. You might know a cost per installation. You might know how many installations were on time and how many were late. You might also know something about the profile of recipients, because when they applied, they might have had to tell you if they were elderly or if they were a young family. You'll also have monitoring data. Typically, when you're running a program like this, you might do a customer satisfaction questionnaire. You might monitor complaints. You might even be going so far as to monitor the energy consumption in the homes of the people who you're subsidising. Or you might monitor the temperatures in the homes of the people you're subsidising. So there will be some data that you can monitor while the program is being implemented, while it's underway. And then the third element is you might do some additional research. So that could be interviews with your program managers, with the beneficiaries, or with other stakeholders. You might want to do some sort of quantitative survey. You might want to interview people who you thought might apply for the subsidy but didn't, so people who would qualify but who you didn't hear from, so you can find out why they didn't take part. And all of this data, you should be thinking about how you'll analyse it. So you would want to know if there are differences between different types of household, for example, or by where they lived, or by when they took part in the programme. So it might be that people who applied early had problems because they were teething difficulties, but then they were solved later on in the process. So you need to think about proper analysis, or the analysis approach you're going to take to the data as well. The second element is impact evaluation. Did the programme make a difference? This sometimes gets called other things. It might be called attribution. So you might hear people saying, can we attribute these benefits to your activity? So what that means is, did your activity cause these benefits? Sometimes it gets called additionality. You hear people talk about additional impacts or additional benefits. They're the ones that were due to the programme. People also talk about dead weight or free riders. Now they're actions that would have happened anyway. So on our hypothetical example, people who would have installed the energy efficiency measures without the subsidy. Particularly in North America, you might hear people talking about net to gross as a way of understanding the relative impact of the programme compared to other things. So impact evaluation is really important because it tells us what the difference was as a result of our activities. So how much more energy we've saved, how many more households aren't in fuel poverty, how much comfort we've helped, how much carbon has been reduced. And generally there are 4 mechanisms by which it's possible to evaluate impact. The first one of these is running an experiment, a randomized control trial. Now the key features of this are that you would randomly deliver the programme to some participants and not to others. So you would have what they call a treatment group, the group that received the programme, and a control group of similar people who hadn't received the programme. So for example, you could split applicants for the subsidy into 2 groups, provide the subsidy to one group and monitor them, and not provide the subsidy to another group and monitor them. You could then measure your indicator of interest, which might be energy saving, and see if there's a statistically significant difference between the 2 groups, between the treatment and the control group. If there is a significant difference there, that is proof that your intervention caused the change, because your 2 groups are identical in all characteristics except one received your programme and one didn't. Because of that, because this mechanism produces proof, it's often thought of as a gold standard, the best way of establishing impact. However, it's often not possible to do a randomized control trial. It can be expensive and it can be difficult, and sometimes policymakers don't like it because they would like to be able to deliver everything to everybody at once. So an alternative approach to establishing impact is to use statistics. Comparing statistical data about groups affected by the programme with those that aren't. So for example, you could compare energy consumption in the group that you've supported with energy consumption in the wider population, or better still, a wider population of similar homes. You could establish whether there's a statistically significant difference. For example, in in those two groups. The challenge here can be getting the data. That can be very difficult. The third mechanism for establishing impact could be a case-based approach. So you could do an in-depth examination of specific cases to really understand what's happened in that case and why that's happened. So, for example, in our example, we could do detailed before and after monitoring of the energy consumption in participants' homes. We could do interviews, lots of interviews over time with the occupants. We could measure internal temperatures. We could look at visits to the doctor to see if they'd gone down. So we could capture lots and lots of data about a small number of cases. That can help you as well to learn about the context, what works, who different things work for. And if you do a few cases, you can compare between them and within cases. You might even do some case studies of non-participants as well as case studies of participants to try and understand how they're different in their behaviour. And you can use this case-based approach to test your theory of change. The fourth approach to impact assessment I want to talk about is theory-based approach, which is conducting a rigorous test of your theory of change to establish whether you've got evidence for it actually working in practice. So this theoretical thing that we developed at the beginning of the evaluation, does that really work in real life? And if it does, whether the programme influenced the outcomes and how the programme influenced the outcomes. And thirdly, looking at what else is going on that might explain what you're seeing. So as well as the subsidy for energy efficiency within these homes, there might be someone else might be running a campaign to promote LED light bulbs, and they might be on discount in a local superstore. So that might lead to increased take-up of those bulbs. Theory-based evaluation can be implemented alongside the other mechanisms and would be a way to pull them all together into a single evaluation. And I just want to describe one approach to theory-based impact assessment, which is contribution analysis. And this is an approach that was developed in the health service by a Canadian guy and has been implemented in a lot of more complex interventions over the last 20 years or so. And contribution analysis takes a 7-stage approach, starting with setting out what they call the attribution problem to be assessed. So what's the question we're really trying to answer with this analysis? Develop the theory of change. We've done that. Populate that theory of change with existing evidence. So saying, why do we think that's true? And how do we think, as stage 4, the programme contributes to the outcomes? When you try and do that at the beginning of an evaluation, you'll find there are lots of gaps, things you don't know, lots of questions come up. So you would then seek evidence to fill those gaps. And then you'd revise your contribution story and say, okay, is what we've got now convincing? Have we got a convincing contribution story? If you haven't, you'd get some more data and try and make it convincing. And at the end, your test of this is, can you convince, well, is it convincing for other stakeholders? Can you take it and present it to others outside your evaluation or your policy making team, and they think, yeah, that makes sense. That the story you're articulating about the contribution this program's made, it seems valid. So if we look at these 4 approaches, they've all got strengths and weaknesses. The experimental method is proof, that's fantastic, but it's difficult in practice. It also might not provide an answer, so you might run your experiment and not find a statistically significant difference. So you're back at square one if you do that. Experiments also don't tell you very much about why something made a difference or how it made a difference. It doesn't tell you if it could have been better. So it might have made a difference, but maybe it could have made a much bigger difference if you'd designed the program in a different way. And importantly as well, it won't tell you if it'll work elsewhere. So let's say our imaginary program was just for the elderly. It won't tell us if it would work for young families. Statistical evaluation impact assessment also provides very strong evidence, but it's very hard to get the data in some circumstances, and it needs a large sample. And it has similar problems to the experimental method in the things it doesn't tell you. Case-based approaches have a really rich understanding of outcomes and really help you to understand why and how the outcomes are achieved. So they tell you a lot about why and how the impact was achieved, whether you could do more, probably tell you something about whether it would work elsewhere if that's a question you consider. But it's very hard to generalize from them, and it doesn't prove causality. And for that reason, it's seen as less rigorous, particularly if you've got economist stakeholders who you want to present your data to. They will often be looking at randomized controlled trials as the best thing to do. And finally, the theory-based approach is a kind of combination of rigor and understanding. So it does give you a rigorous approach. It does consider alternative explanations. It does give you that rich understanding of why and how the outcomes are achieved. It still doesn't prove causality, and so is less rigorous, but it does help you to demonstrate whether or not there's a contribution. So different approaches will be valid at different times. So there may be an occasion when you've got an excellent opportunity to do an experiment or to take a statistical approach. There might be other times when it's only possible to do some case studies. But whichever approach you take, it's important to do it with rigor, and it's important to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. So moving on from impact evaluation to the third branch of evaluation, which is economic evaluation. That's essentially a cost-benefit analysis, and you're probably familiar with those. It's basically saying, well, how much bigger were the benefits than the costs? We hope the benefits are bigger than the costs. And was that then worthwhile? And typically you would think about that at three levels. Might be the cost and benefits to government, the costs and benefits to participants, or the overall societal costs and benefits. Whichever one you choose, and ideally you would probably do government and society, but whichever one you choose, it's important to make sure that you only include costs and benefits for that level. It's also important to consider all your additional costs, so the costs you have because you have the program, and all the additional benefits, so the benefits that come because of the program. So being careful not to miss anything out, but equally being careful only to have those which are additional. And it's important to consider lifetime costs and benefits. And that's particularly important if you've got activities that can have different lifetimes. So back to our imaginary example, you might have one group of people who you're supporting who are owner-occupiers. They might stay in their homes for much longer than tenants as another group of owner-occupiers. So the benefits you're achieving have a longer lifetime for the owner-occupiers than for the tenants. So it just needs to be taken into account. I'm not saying one's better or worse, it just needs to be thought through. The other thing to think about is the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency measures, as well as saving money, reducing energy consumption and saving carbon, help to contribute to energy security, help to reduce peak demand, can lead to economic growth. For example, there would be some jobs to install these energy efficiency measures that we're subsidising. Improve health and well-being for people in their homes, can improve productivity and lead to air quality and reduce pollution. So the multiple benefits should also be incorporated in your cost-benefit analysis. Otherwise, you're only looking at one part of the coin. And fortunately, there's a webinar on multiple benefits next month, April the 19th. So that was a shameless plug as well. So having completed the three elements of the evaluation, the next step is to analyse what you've got. Draw it all together. Draw together the evidence. Consider things like unintended consequences, alternative explanations, any possible bias that might have come into your data collection or your analysis. At that stage, you should be testing and exploring your results with participants, with stakeholders, saying, yeah, does this make sense? Does this reflect your experience? Is this useful? What else would you like to know? How else can we analyse it? And then communicating this, communicating the lessons internally within your organisation so that you can use it in future programmes. Identifying what you've learned for future evaluations. Publishing. Bring it to the IEPPEC conference and publish a paper on it. Very important to communicate evaluation results. So that in 20 minutes was how to do an evaluation. I'll point you to some resources at the end which can help you with some reference materials. But you can also use IEPPEC, and I see Jean-Sébastien has just posted the LinkedIn group, which you can join as well. IEPPEC is an evaluation community. We've got evaluators, we've got policymakers, we've got academics. And we hold a conference every 2 years. We hold webinars. Now, this is the first one, the next one's in April, and we hope to continue them as a regular activity. All the proceedings of our conferences, which have been peer-reviewed, are available on our website, and you can search those. So if you're looking for particular types of evaluations or particular programs, you can search for those. What we do is we enable sharing of best practice, so we can all learn from each other. It's really useful to learn from other jurisdictions. Something you've tried in Poland might be very useful to someone in Czech Republic. And it also allows you to test ideas and develop new practice. Except for the conference, everything's free. And the conference is hopefully reasonably priced. So we're a registered charity. Our mission is to enable better evaluation. So to summarise, evaluation leads to more effective policies and programs. It should be embedded in your policy and program design process. It's important to include process, impact, and economic evaluation. It should be structured around a theory of change or a program logic, whatever you want to call it. Should use transparent processes, engage stakeholders, and make sure you integrate the learnings, both about your programs and about evaluation. And please use the IEPPEC resources and do attend our conference. Just as a final slide here, I've put up some useful resources. First and foremost, there's the IEPPEC website for Europe and for North America. I've flagged up a site called Better Evaluation, which is a really useful general evaluation resource and a good place to start if you've got a specific question. It's not energy focused, but all the principles still hold. I referred you to a couple of UK government guidance documents about ex-ante evaluation and one about ex-post evaluation. I've also given you the link to the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK's guidance on conducting evaluation, which is sort of more specifically focused on energy programs and policies. Item number 6 on this list is about impact assessment and is a very good guide to those 4 different approaches to impact assessment. I've given you a link to a document about experiments and using randomized control trials. And the final one on the list is the IEA's guide to capturing the multiple benefits of energy efficiency, which is both interesting and pre-reading for the next webinar. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for coming and for listening. I'm very happy to take your questions.